Let's begin with a word of prayer. Dear Father in heaven, we are thankful for this morning. We are thankful for the time that we can spend together studying. And we are thankful for the truths that come from your word and for the light that has been shining upon our path. And we invite your Holy Spirit to speak to our hearts, to direct and guide us in this study. We pray, Lord, that we can be changed by the things that we study and that we can understand these things. For the sake of others, that we can share these truths and that others can be blessed as well. Be with us now, we pray, in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, good morning, everyone. So we had, of course, a little interesting discussion yesterday trying to understand Pentecost, particularly how it was understood by different people have understood it, but we were looking at the Karaites' understanding and the biblical understanding. Now, the statement that I found in the Spirit of Prophecy is from Patriarchs and Prophets. And let me see if I can find it again. Well, I'll just read it. I did send it out as an email to most of you, I think. But other people who didn't get the email, I can read it for them. So it's Patriarchs and Prophets, page 539 and 540. Sister White says, the Passover was followed by 7 days' feast of unleavened bread. The first and seventh day were days of holy convocation, when no servile work was to be performed. On the second day of the feast, the first fruits of the year's harvest were presented before God. Barley was the earliest grain in Palestine, and at the opening of the feast it was beginning to ripen. A sheaf of this grain was waved by the priests before the altar of God as an acknowledgement that all was his. Not until this ceremony had been performed was the harvest to be gathered. And then she says, 50 days from the offering of first fruits came the Pentecost, called also the Feast of Harvest and the Feast of Weeks. As an expression of gratitude for the grain prepared as food, 2 loaves baked with leaven were presented before God. The Pentecost occupied but 1 day, which was devoted to religious service. So in understanding the Pentecost, it's pretty clear from this statement that it's from the 16th day of the first month, which is Feast of First Fruits, that you count the 50 days, and not from the day after the weekly Sabbath. So the Sabbath referred to in Leviticus 23 is the Sabbath, which is the rest that occurs on the 15th day of the month, which is the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And this is all tied together with the understanding of what happens in 31 AD. That is, that it's a high Sabbath. So that's one of the things that tells us that Jesus was crucified on a Friday, not on a Wednesday. But there's so much of this has been muddied by party spirit, and not just within Christianity and Protestantism of the present day, but really goes back to debates and controversies that existed within Judaism. Now, one of the things that we deal with Pentecost in connection with the giving of the law on Mount Sinai. So this is a tradition that I can't remember around which century it came in, but it's a much later tradition. The idea that Pentecost is a commemoration of the giving of the law on Mount Sinai, which it doesn't appear to be. And Stephen has worked out the chronology that it doesn't align with that. Ellen White doesn't say that it is, so we now have no Spirit of Prophecy support for the idea that Pentecost is the date that the law was given. And Pentecost we place as the 6th day of the 3rd month. So that's what you see here in this this chart of 457 BC. So the journey from the river Ahava that happened after 3 days to Jerusalem on the first day of the 5th month, that's followed by 3 days, with the gold and silver marking the beginning and the ending of those periods of 3 days. The center of that is Pentecost, the 6th day of the 3rd month. And we're counting the 54 days just in an ordinal count. That is, that's how Pentecost is counted. So when they talk about 7 weeks, they're doing that ordinally. That is, they're starting from the Sunday as being the first day in we're talking about, when I say the Sunday, in Christ, the day that Christ was resurrected, to the Pentecost in Acts, that's going to be 50 days later. But to count 7 days, you're counting inclusively. That is, you're starting as Sunday being the first day. So the day of the resurrection is day 1 of your 7-week count. But if we didn't count it inclusively, you would just normally count, if you're on a Sunday and you're going to count 7 weeks, you're going to just count them as 49 days. But you can see they're counting inclusively. So that's why the 50th day is also the day of Pentecost in 31 AD, is a Sunday. Now, one of the reasons why some Adventists, and when I say Adventists, I mean people who have been Seventh-day Adventists, but not necessarily are Seventh-day Adventists anymore, but people who at least subscribe to some of our beliefs, they will often not like the idea that Jesus was resurrected on a Sunday and that Pentecost was on a Sunday, because they see it as a support for Sunday worship. So sometimes they will become lunar Sabbatarians, or they'll become some kind of other offshoot of Adventism. And usually, in order to do this, they're usually going to have to reject the spirit of prophecy. And I've seen it happen to people. I've seen people who are Seventh-day Adventists study some lunar Sabbatarian material, and in a couple of days, they've rejected the spirit of prophecy and have adopted all kinds of strange ideas. Because once you reject the spirit of prophecy, you open the door to all kinds of false teachings. And so Miller's rules also apply to the spirit of prophecy. That is, we can't somehow put Ellen White as, when we say she's a lesser light, as many Adventists say, that leading to the greater light, which is the Bible. And I don't quite see it that way. I don't see her statement that way. But because in the Bible, I also think is a lesser light, because the Bible is leading us to Christ, who is the greater light. And being a lesser light is a reference to the moon that reflects the light of the sun. So anyway, once you reject the spirit of prophecy, you open up the door to all kinds of error. And that's why we can't do that. So, but I don't like to just take a statement from the spirit of prophecy and just say that's the argument. We do need to answer the biblical questions. So if we go back to what we were studying here in Leviticus 23, and we're dealing with first fruits. If you just read the King James and you just look at it in this way, it seems on the surface, the morrow after the Sabbath, that must be the 7th-day Sabbath. But when you read about the Feast of Unleavened Bread, when we deal with the Passover and so forth, we know that the Passover is on the 14th day of the month. So in the 14th day of the first month, at even is the Lord's Passover. On the 15th day of the same month is the feast of unleavened bread. Unto the Lord 7 days ye must eat unleavened bread. In the first day ye shall have an holy convocation. Ye shall do no servile work therein. So Ellen White refers to this. But ye shall offer an offering by fire unto the Lord 7 days. In the seventh day is an holy convocation. Ye shall do no servile work therein. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, When ye come into the land which I give you, and shall reap the harvest thereof, then ye shall bring a sheaf of the firstfruits of your harvest unto the priest, and he shall wave the sheaf before the Lord to be accepted for you. On the morrow after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it. So the Sabbath here is not referring to the seventh day Sabbath, but to that Sabbath of rest that's attached to the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is the 15th. So the day after is going to be the 16th. And that's what Ellen White is saying. But I understand why people read it this way. It's just in a surface reading of it, it appears to be that way. But we don't have any statement that tries to attach it to the first day of the week. So it's just an inference that people commonly make, but we would have to say that it's incorrect. And it never became an issue until the Karaites came along. So whatever century that is, I can't remember if it's the 9th century or the 8th century, whenever the Karaite Jews came along and were challenging the rabbinic Jews. And these were really political issues that existed within Judaism. A party spirit had arisen, had been around for a long time in Judaism, but this was a contentious issue. So the calendar was one of them. How do we count the calendar? How do we start the start of the year? For the Jews, they had, since the 4th century, this cycle using the Metonic cycle, and it didn't always line up with the new moon. So the Karaites adopted a new moon for each month, which the Jews did not. And then we also had the issue of Pentecost. So in Millerite history, when we say that the Millerites used the Karaite calendar, they were mistaken. They didn't use the Karaite calendar to start the year. But we're going to look at that. So what we want to do now is, after looking at 457 BC, to understand the significance of this, we really need to move to Samuel Snow's letters and to Millerite history. Now, one of the things that we're going to notice here is this period of 107 days and these 54 days. One is the 54 days are doubled, and the 54 days represent the 5th day of the 4th month, and the 107 days represent the 10th day of the 7th month. So one thing we can see here is that the 10th day of the 7th month is represented, which in this number of days that's going to be expressed as the center of this chiasm from the 1st day of the 5th month to the 20th day of the 9th month. And over to the right here, you'll see the 1st day of the 10th month and the 1st day of the 1st month. This is the 3-month period in which they are given to perform these divorces, the separation from the strange wives, according to the law. So that's why it's here on this chart. But it is interesting that this history begins on the 1st day of the 1st month and ends on the 1st day of the 1st month. So it's marking the Jewish year 457 BC quite clearly in Ezra 7 to 10. And of course, Ezra 7 to 10, we would take as a symbol of the 10th day of the 7th month as well. And so that's where all of this chronology is laid out. So there's a lot of profound things regarding this. And we looked at like the 220 Nethinim and the symbol of that, because this is 220 years or from 677 BC, which starts the 2520, that these 3 decrees are using to attach the 2300 days to the 2520 or to the 2020 to make the 2520. So there's all kinds of symbols. The two periods of 70 days, the 140 days, that reminds us of the two periods of 70 years for Manasseh and then Daniel's captivity that make up 140 years. Though this is literally 138 and 69 and 69, but symbolically it represents that. And then we have these dates, the first day of the first month, which we're going to look at in Millerite history, and of course the 10th day of the seventh month, and Pentecost, and the first day of the first month in Millerite history. So these all become significant in Millerite history. Now, the chart that I usually use is rather involved. So this is what we're going to come to understand. We're going to go through this. I'll probably send people a copy of this again, just so they have it as a reference, even though it's in some of the papers. So this I had made in 2017. And a lot of dates. It deals with Samuel Snow's letters, not just the ones from 1844, but also from 1842, 1843 as well. And it shows a number of chiasms, so it's a little bit hard to look at sometimes. There are more structural chiasms than what are represented here. And it has the information at the bottom with the different letters, their dates and when they were published and written and so forth. It also deals with his other papers. So there's 3 boxes there. The first box is his papers that were published, or his letters that were published, 1842 and 1843. The center ones are the ones in 1844 that are part of that structure leading up to the July 18th letter. And the bottom box there on the right is his articles that were published prior to October 22nd, 1844, but after the Midnight Cry was given. So that is Prophetic Chronology, August 22nd, and the True Midnight Cry, the one. These two papers get confused because they're both published on the same day. And then Prophetic Chronology, another publishing of one of his studies on chronology. And these can all in the book. What's it called? The Three Angels' Messages source book. So in the Three Angels' Messages source book, I have all of these letters that are referenced here. They're all published in that book, so people don't have to go on the internet and search them out. And it took a lot of work finding these. Unfortunately, the E.G. White disc doesn't have all of Snow's letters. It doesn't have the Midnight Cry magazine articles in it. It's not included in there. And most of these were from the Midnight Cry. I don't know why they didn't put all of Snow's stuff on the E.G. White disc. I would have thought those would be pretty important. But we do have them collected in that PDF, which maybe what I'll do, even though I know lots of you have it, I'll send it out again to everyone with this diagram. Now, looking at Millerite history, what I'll maybe do is I'll bring up this PDF. So hang on a second. So this is the Three Angels' Messages source book. And we put this together in 2017. That was when I was in Washington at the Rabanskis. And so they helped me put this together, which was something I couldn't have done in such a short period of time. They were very, very helpful in doing that. So you can see here in the table of contents, so let me bring this up. There's a section of the book called The Midnight Cry, and this is going to have these letters of Samuel Snow plus some other material. So each of these chapters, I start out with a chapter from the Spirit of Prophecy on the first, second, third angel's message and the Midnight Cry. And those are from the Spirit of Prophecy, volume 4. And then you can see Samuel Snow's letters, 1842. There's 2 things that were published in the Signs. And then May 11th, 1843, a letter from Snow in the Signs. And then Remarks of Brother Samuel S. Snow, Signs of the Times, February 28th, 1844. That's actually his testimony that was given on December 31st, 1843. And then we have Miller's letter concerning the 7th Jewish month. That was published May 3rd, 1843 in the Signs of the Times. It was written May 3rd, 1843 and published in the Signs March 17th, 1843, which doesn't make sense because that would be backwards. So I'm not sure exactly what the May 3rd, 1843 date is. I'd have to look at that again. And then we have the Midnight Cry. That's his February 16th letter. We're going to look at all of these things, not in detail, just sort of briefly, which is published in February 22nd in the Midnight Cry and republished on April 3rd. And so I don't have the republishing of it here. I just have in there, I have the disclaimer that's with it. And it's going to be republished April 3rd, 1844, which happens to be the Passover that the Jews and the Karaites kept in 1844. And then his letter, which we don't normally include, it doesn't relate to the Midnight Cry at all, but I put it in here. It's his May 1st Signs of the Times letter to the editor, which is addressing the disappointment and the mocking that occurred. So it's kind of interesting in that sense. But his second letter, we call it, is the May 2nd letter, and that's the one that's published on the correct Passover. We don't know the date of its writing. And then we have a May 2nd, 1844 letter. So Samuel Snow has published this. And then we also have this letter that's in the Memoirs of William Miller. But this letter is the one where he apologizes for being wrong. And then Samuel Snow's June 22nd letter, that's Pentecost. So we're going to look at that and its publishing date and all those things. And then some other articles by C.S. Minor. And if you remember C.S. Minor, we ran into her in Early Writings, page 74. So she's the one who was going to Old Jerusalem. But she was a follower of Samuel Snow. She was very interested in Samuel Snow's work and supportive of his work. And then the Confirming the Covenant, Samuel Snow's letter. And that's pretty important here in the context of all the things we've been studying about the covenant. And we can see that Samuel Snow has made some errors. And I don't really want to go into all the content of these letters, but I do want to point out some details. And then the True Midnight Cry, and that's going to be his August 22nd. So that Confirming the Covenant one is the July 18th. That's the last letter published before midnight. And then you have the True Midnight Cry, all these other letters. So we will take a look at those. Now, another paper that I have that is rather, it's useful in understanding this, is a paper that I wrote regarding how they came to understand what we call the fullness of the year. That is, how they came to understand the mistake that they had made in saying that it was 1843, that Jesus was going to come back in 1843. And that paper here, I'm going to open it up. I think it's entitled The Millerites Full Year, Fullness of the Year, no, 0 Year Concept. So let me see. I guess the last time I edited that was in 2016. So open this up, and maybe I should email this to everyone as well. Now, this issue of the full year and the no 0 year, so I'm not going to go into this in detail, but this is a very useful paper to read. It's very helpful to understand why they didn't just, once they realized there was no 0 year, they didn't just go to 1843. They didn't just say, we're going to correct it. Jesus is now coming back in 1844. Because that's not how it happened. There was this gradual process of understanding as they approached 1844. They had to come to understand, they wanted to understand, how do we nail this down? How do we define exactly when Jesus is coming back? Because remember, Miller initially says Jesus is going to come back about the year 1843. Now, when did they first try to nail this down to 1843 and say that it's going to be 1843? Does anybody know?
I don't have a direct answer for that.
Okay. Anybody else? Why did they have to now say it's going to be the year 1843? Must have too much stuff open here. Just hang on.
I'm with Dwight.
What's that? You're with Dwight?
I'm with Dwight.
Okay, what about the 1843 chart? When they had
Makes
the,
sense.
yeah, so when they had the 1843 chart, remember Jeff talked about how they had to get rid of the if, or not the, the if that is, if my understanding of the chronology is correct, then Jesus is coming back in the year 1843. So they had to get rid of that if. When they made the chart, they now had committed themselves to 1843. And this was a bit of a struggle, in that they had originally taken the view that we can't know the day or the hour of Christ's return. So Miller was a little bit fuzzy about when Jesus is going to come. So he had this chronology of saying that if this is correct, then he's going to come about the year 1843. But now they had to get rid of that if. And this opened up the door for some of the stuff that happened after October 22nd, 1844. That is, people were saying, well, Miller was just wrong about the chronology or the starting point, or how we're going to look at this. So people started moving the dates when their disappointment occurred. And part of this was this idea of this if, that is, people just felt, well, Miller had moved away from his initial position, which was if the chronology is correct. So all you have to do now is find out what the true chronology is. Now, if you look at Miller's initial understanding, one of the things that became a real issue was the 490 years. And we're going to see this, and I'm mentioning this because this is going to be very important in understanding some of these dates. Then when we look at 457. So when I wrote this paper, though, I didn't understand this, so I don't have it in here particularly. So I probably should find that statement. But Miller, we're going to read this statement here. He says, we learn by the instruction of Gabriel that the 70 weeks were part of the vision, and that Daniel was commanded to begin the 70 weeks at the going forth of the decree, to build the streets and walls of Jerusalem in troublous times, that this decree given to Ezra was exactly 490 years to a day before the crucifixion of Christ, and that there is no account by Bible or any historian that there was ever any, and this, yeah, ever any, and I guess I need to somehow, I'm just going to open this up again because it didn't, there's too much, I'd used up too much memory. So you're going to have to, I'm going to have to share the screen again here too. Yeah, here it is. Good. Any other decree to build the streets and walls of Jerusalem, we think the proof is strong that the vision of Daniel begins 457 years before Christ, which take from 2300, leaves 1843 after Christ, when the vision must be finished. So this decree was given 457 years before Christ. The 70 weeks began, and if they ended at the death of Christ, which we have proved did end them, then the 70 weeks ended after Christ, 33 years, making in all 490 years, which is 70 weeks of years. So we can see the problem here. What is the first problem that Miller has in understanding this? The 70 weeks. What's the mistake he's making?
So I'm assuming you're talking about the 0 year.
Right. So he's using a math that has a 0, right? So if you're going to subtract these numbers, if you're going to use math, you always have a 0 that's implied within the math itself. So you can't take 457 years BC and 1843 years AD and add them together to get 490 years. That's going to be 489 years, because when you add BC and AD, you have to subtract 1 from your total. If you're adding BC and AD, you're subtracting 1. And if you're subtracting BC and AD, you're going to add 1. So that is, if you took 1843 minus, or not 1840, 33 AD minus 490, you would come to where? So I'll just do the math here. I'll show you what I mean.
I understand what you're doing and doing the math, but as a historical question,
Yeah.
where did the concept of 0 come from?
Well, I know the 0 was first used by the Arabs, or maybe the Hindus, but it didn't exist in other math. That is, the idea even of a negative number took a long time to develop.
My thought process is, I believe if we look at history, that the concept of 0 was being widely promoted by, as you were initially saying, an Arabic mathematician.
Yeah.
So could we say that 0 is a contribution of Islam?
Oh, yeah. There's no doubt about that. I mean, even our numbering system is Arabic numerals. Right? So the numbers we use are Arabic letters.
Understood.
Yeah. So what I did is I took 33 AD and I subtracted 490 and I got minus 457. But since I subtracted, I just changed that, I would actually have to add 1, and that would be 458. So if you had the 70 weeks end in 33 AD, 490 years would begin in 458. And actually, this was one of the solutions that first came about when they recognized there was no 0 year. They didn't adjust the end, they adjusted the beginning. That is, they looked at the 70 weeks and they said, well, we must have then the beginning of this 70 weeks begin in 458. And that lasted for about 2 weeks. And then they went back to 457. So there was a lot of uncertainty as they began to approach 1843 on how to address this. Now, in December of 1842, so the 1843 chart was made in May of 1842. May and June, it was published in that period there. But when they had the year 1843 on the 1843 chart, when did it start and when did it end when they made the chart?
They made the chart in 1842.
Yeah, so how did they understand the year 1843 when they made the chart? So they have the chart, 1843, Jesus is coming back. What date did they use to start the year 1843 when they made the chart? How did they understand that year?
Wasn't it that they understood March 21st, 1843?
No, January 1st. So they first came to place March 21st, 1843 in December of 1842. And this is William Miller himself who introduces the idea that the year 1843 is the Jewish year 1843. And he had it go from March 21st, 1843 to March 21st, 1844, which seems kind of odd in that he's not really even using the Jewish calendar. He's just using the equinox in the way that he's understanding it. So he's going to say the first day of the Jewish year is March 21st. So he doesn't really have an understanding of the biblical calendar. He just knows it starts in the spring, and he assumes that it starts with the equinox. So it's not until just before 1843, before the first day of 1843, that Miller is going to move the time period not to January 1st, 1843, but to March 21st, 1843, as the earliest that Jesus can come back. Now, at this point, they are just beginning to come to understand that there is no 0 year. So, I maybe should have asked the question first. So, why do you think he did that? Why did he move the start of the year to March 21st?
Wasn't he trying to understand the year as God would present it?
Okay, well, as they're approaching 1843, they start to realize that there is no 0 year. So the way that we understand it as Adventists, generally Adventists would have this impression that the Millerites came to understand there was no 0 year. When? When did they understand there was no 0 year? In your understanding as a Seventh-day Adventist, how do you think Seventh-day Adventists understand that? If you can think back to your knowledge before, what was the impression that was presented in everything that you ever heard about the no 0 year?
You're asking me to go back almost 50 years. Thank you.
Yeah. So what would be the general impression? We would have the impression that the first disappointment was the result of them not understanding that there was no 0 year, correct?
Right.
Yeah.
So we would think the first disappointment, after the first disappointment, then they realized they had made a mistake. that there was no 0 year, and now they're going to take that into account. But they already are taking that into account in 1842. They're coming to understand that, and they're going to be addressing it in the papers. So you can see here, in 1842, Miller hasn't a concept that there is no 0 year yet. But he's going to come to understand that, because as people begin to look at this chronology in more detail, they start to realize there is this problem in the reckoning. So this simple idea that you can just start in 457 BC, subtract 490 years, and get 33, that means that's the end of the 490 years. You would have to actually add, and so that would be 34 AD. Now, the other thing, of course, that is a pretty obvious mistake, he has the death of Christ in 33 AD, ending the 70 weeks. That is, he doesn't have the midst of the week. And he also makes a pretty interesting statement that I thought was, to me, back then when I did this paper in 2015, this idea that he says that that decree given to Ezra was exactly 490 years to the day, or to a day, before the crucifixion of Christ. So when did the decree of Ezra go forth? Artaxerxes' decree in the book of Ezra here. So when was this decree given? He says given to Ezra exactly 490 years to a day before the crucifixion of Christ.
They
Is
would
that
put it in the spring, right?
what's that?
They would put it in the spring.
Yeah, it puts it in the spring. But if he says to a day, what is he talking about there? Why to a day? Because what day is Jesus crucified?
Passover.
Yeah, he's crucified on Passover. Now, so that's going to be the 14th day of the first month. And I don't have it in this paper because I hadn't read it at that time. But actually, Miller believes that Jesus was crucified 2 days before Passover. So he believed Jesus was crucified on the 12th day of the first month, because it talks about Judas betraying Jesus 2 days before the Passover. And he takes that statement, and I probably should have had this queued up if I'd been thinking about it. I didn't know I was going to go into this kind of detail, but I'll try to get that stuff later. I'm not going to bring this up. I'm not going to get you the statement, but I will get it and email that as well. So I'll get together an email. Not sure when I'm going to do that. It's a pretty busy day, but I'll put together an email. I'll get that statement of Miller's where he says it's the 12th day of the first month. And so if he has Jesus crucified on the 12th day of the first month, when is he then marking the beginning of that 490 years in 457? What date is he beginning that? If he has Jesus crucified on the 12th day of the first month in 457 BC, what date is he going to mark for the start of the 70 weeks?
Can you restate your question?
So he has Jesus crucified on the 12th day of the first month in 33 AD, 490 years to a day after the decree is given to Ezra. So what date is he going to have the decree given to Ezra? in 457 BC.
I guess it would be the 12th day of the first month then too.
Right. So he's going to mark it at the river Ahava. Right? Because that's where they are on the 12th day of the first month. Now, it seems kind of a strange language that he's using here, because given to Ezra. And so he's going to say the decree was given to Ezra. Well, it would have had to been given before that. But I mean, maybe what he means is the going forth of the decree. So originally when I wrote this paper, I thought that the going forth of the decree, that Miller must have considered that to be the first day of the first month. Now, the first day of the first month is April 26th. And no, Jesus was crucified April 27th in 31 AD. So, I mean, maybe the idea is that Jesus was crucified April 26th, or maybe he thought it was March 27th in 457. So I didn't know what he meant by 2 a day. But later, when I found that he says that Jesus was crucified on the 12th day of the first month, 2 days before the Passover, then I understood what he meant. He was going by the 12th day of the first month. Now, there's some other problems here in Miller's statement, as you can see. So what are some other discrepancies from our understanding of Artaxerxes' decree? So when he says, we learned by the instruction of Gabriel that the 70 weeks were a part of the vision, and that Daniel was commanded to begin the 70 weeks at the going forth of the decree to build the streets and walls of Jerusalem in troublous times. What's the mistake there?
He's using the wrong decree.
Okay, so somehow, because we know the decree for the streets and the walls is Artaxerxes' second decree that's 13 years later. And it doesn't say in Daniel that this decree is to build the streets and the walls. It just says that the streets and the walls will be built even in troublous times, which is going to happen 13 years later. So there is this problem that Miller has, that in some ways Adventists have inherited to varying degrees. That is, our understanding of these decrees is not complete. That is, we look at Artaxerxes' decree, but in a sense we conflate all of the decrees into one decree. We tie it all to Artaxerxes. So just to go back here to Daniel, when we read this, 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city, and it lists these 6 different things: finished transgression, etc. And know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem unto the Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks. So it takes this and divides this 70 weeks that's mentioned in verse 24 into a Jubilee cycle, then 62 weeks, and then it says, the street shall be built again and the wall even in troublous times. And then it says, after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood. So this is going to be talking about first Christ being crucified in the midst of the week, and then the destruction of the city and the sanctuary in 70 AD. And then it's going to go back in verse 27. He shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. So it goes back and references this week again, but now divides it into 2, because it says, and in the midst of the week, he shall cause the sacrifice and oblation to cease. And then again mentions the destruction of Jerusalem, and what's going to happen to Rome that does the destruction. So here in reading this back in Millerite history, there's sort of a superficial reading of this text. They're not addressing all these different points. They just kind of skim over things. Now, when we look at the Bishop's Bible, so this is an earlier translation, and it looks at this verse, it says, "Know therefore and understand from the going forth of the commandment to bring again the people." So that word bring again is shuv, right? We've talked about that. So this is the return of the people on the first day of the 5th month, and to build Jerusalem, right? So that's going to be the period of time from the first day of the 5th month to the 20th day of the 9th month. Now, the streets and walls being built again is a reference to Artaxerxes' second decree in his 20th year of his reign that we find in the book of Nehemiah. And then this 62 weeks is this period of time intervening between this period of 7 weeks and the 1 week. But these 62 weeks are also neglected by scholars. It's just like they're there. We don't know what they mean. Sometimes people try to put the streets and the walls being built in that period of time. You see all kinds of different interpretations of the decrees, of the chronology of that history. So most of us aren't familiar with all these varying views. But there's a problem here we can see with Millerites' understanding, that they haven't got this sorted out. They don't have Christ crucified in the midst of the week. And they've conflated these different decrees together. So these are things that are sorted out partly in Millerite history under the midnight cry, under the second angel's message. So Miller doesn't sort these things out himself. These are going to be sorted out first by Samuel Snow. Now, the other thing that ends up happening is our movement returns to the old path, and we begin to understand Millerite history. That is, we reconstruct Millerite history and Millerite understanding. And there's 2 different paths that this movement takes. And there were many people who, in going back to the 1843 chart, want to go back to Millerite understanding. That is, they're going to take a position that William Miller is correct about many things, even things that he disagrees with Spirit of Prophecy about. That is, Ellen White is going to have to bow to Millerite understanding. What would be an example of this? How did Miller understand the 6,000 years? So Ellen White endorses Samuel Snow's Midnight Cry, which is published on August 22nd, 1844. And what's the first argument that Samuel Snow presents in the Midnight Cry? What's his first argument that the 2300 days ends in the fall of 1844?
That's the close of the 6,000th year as well.
Right. So he's going to have it as the close of the 6,000 years. See if I can find this. I'm going to have to go back a bit. There we go. So this is the true Midnight Cry, and August 22nd, 1844. And when he's going to make his first argument, he's going to say that it's the 6,000 years. See if I can find that. Yeah, the 6,000 years. The period of time allotted for this world in its present state is 6,000 years. So he uses Miller's chronology. Miller adds 153 years to Ussher's chronology. So you can see this right plainly stated here. According to Ussher's chronology, which is commonly received, The Christian era commenced in the year of the world 4004, but Usher has lost in the time of the judges 153 years. So they're going to add 153 years to the time of the judges to get that period of time, and they're going to use this statement in Acts 13 verse 20 that talks about the space of 450 years. So one of the first things that I noticed when I started studying the chronology is that we had kind of inherited this 450 years from Millerites, from Miller's understanding of chronology, and Jeff had been promoting it as well. And he would add the 40 years to this 450 to give us another period of 490. And what's his name? Mark. I can't think of his name. The Scottish guy. What's his name?
Mark Bruce. I'm getting really confused here, or you said 153 and then you're saying 453.
153? What are you talking about?
Yeah, you said that.
453?
Can't even.
Okay, 153 years. There's 450 years of the judges. He's going to add 40 years to that to get 490. So Jeff presents that. Now, when I first presented my chronology in 2014, Mark Bruce was there in Alberta, and he was really upset with me for rejecting this 450 years of Acts 13:20 as referring to the period of the time of the judges, which it doesn't. But this is something we inherited from Millerite history. So there's things that we inherited. We inherited some of their misunderstandings, some of their mistakes. But Ellen White corrects these things. So when we look at Spirit of Prophecy's chronology, Ellen White's chronology, it differs both from Usher's and also from Miller's. Now, the argument is Ellen White endorsed this article. She endorsed the Midnight Cry. So if she endorsed it, it must be correct. That's the argument that's made. It's correct to the point that even if it disagrees with what Ellen White says in other places, we have to accept this article over the Spirit of Prophecy. And this is a position that many people have taken on other issues. They do this with Ellen White's endorsement of the Daystar article. They do this with Ellen White's endorsement of the book Daniel and Revelation by Uriah Smith, and they do it here. And what's the problem with that type of logic? What's the problem with just taking Ellen White's endorsement of a book or even a person and saying, well, we accept her endorsement as authoritative, even when it contradicts other things Ellen White says? What are you doing?
I guess you're fixating on something that will have flaws in it. Like you can endorse something that's correct, but that doesn't mean that everything around that thing is correct.
Right. Yeah. So you can endorse the general idea. I mean, I can say, this is a fantastic book. You need to read it. Does that mean that I say that everything that that author wrote in that book is correct? Obviously not.
Especially if you write that other aspects, that are found in that book, and you write about them, and you say something different about them.
Right. Yeah. So we know that you can't do that. You can't take the endorsement of the midnight cry and then argue that the 6,000 years ended on October 22nd, 1844, when Ellen White will talk about those 6,000 years differently. Plus, the period of the judges, when Ellen White talks about spans of time, she doesn't endorse that great span of time of the period of the judges. For instance, she talks about 400 years from when the command in the book of Deuteronomy regarding Amalek, and with the Amalekites in the time of Saul. And she says that it's 400 years that God delayed this judgments against the Amalekites. Well, if you have 450 years of the judges, then you're going to have a bit of a problem trying to make that 400 years. And that period of the judges being, if it was 450 years, you'd have to add the extra time there as well, because that period of time with the Amalekites is even earlier. So you run into a problem that contradicts the spirit of prophecy. And I've had discussions with these people who believe this, and they're adamant. I mean, the whole reason that Jeff's movement is wrong is because we rejected the 6,000 years. Things like that. So we have to be very careful in how we study these things. Now, this teaches us a lot. It teaches us, for one, that our movement, just because it's led by God, doesn't mean that it's flawless in its understanding of everything. And of course, we've come to understand this. I didn't mean to go there. Go here. Now, the understanding that came to this movement in 2017 regarding Samuel Snow's letters, it came gradually. So we didn't just jump into Samuel Snow's letters. We first came to understand Millerite history. So one of the first things that we would have found is the first day of the 5th month, right? So we talked a bit about that. And that was understood first with Ezra 7:9 in 2013. That's Emiliano introduces this idea just before this split happens within the movement. But he introduces Ezra 7:9. He notices this. And what he's noticing really is that there is this chronology that exists in Millerite history that Adventists just never know about. Adventists never take into account this journey from Babylon to Jerusalem. They just don't know about it. I mean, I'm sure some scholars do, but the average Adventist has no idea about the beginning of the 2300 days and the 70 weeks. What happens in that year in 457 BC? And even like we did a year or so ago, they did, the Adventist Church did a Sabbath school quarterly on Ezra and Nehemiah, and didn't address any of this chronology in the book of Ezra, actually hardly even touched on the book of Ezra, and mostly focused on the book of Nehemiah. So Adventists just don't study these things. They don't understand them. And I think part of it is they know that there's problems in their understanding. And if they focus on it too much, maybe people might notice those problems. I don't know if that's the reason. But, I'd been an Adventist for, 30 some years before I ever knew that there was a journey from Babylon to Jerusalem with a chronology that begins the 2300 days. And the fact that the Millerites only had a sketchy understanding of this, it just means it's something that God had held his hand over, I believe, to a large degree. And it was meant for this movement to understand it. Now, when we zoom in here, so I'm going to try to do this here. We can see up at the top, we got this 187 days. So this is what was being discussed in 2013 that we sorted out by 2014. That is, we have the first day of the first month being April 19th, and the 10th day of the seventh month is October 22nd. And the structure of this 187 days, I don't show the division here, but from the first day of the first month to the first day of the fifth month is 120 days symbolically. And then it's going to be 70 days from the first day of the fifth month to the 10th day of the seventh month. So this understanding here of August 15th, this is what is nailed down in 2014. We know that Exeter is going to be on the first day of the fifth month. And of course, you can see below, that's going to line up with August 22nd, 457 BC, because they're a week apart, the Julian and the Gregorian calendars, in this period of time. And so the first day of the fifth month is the day that they arrive at Jerusalem. And so it happens to be August 22nd, 457, not to be confused with August 22nd, 1844. But the fact that it is also August 22nd, I find interesting. So this is the midnight cry. So this point we're quite familiar with, that Samuel Snow presents the midnight cry at Exeter and the message is empowered. Then we're going to find near the end of 2015 the symbol of midnight. That is, it's going to, part of the thing that as we start to study the midnight cry and we study that history, we find that at Boston, Samuel Snow also presents this message of the midnight cry. And he actually declares that it's midnight. And his statement that he makes in Boston, Loughborough mistakenly takes the words stated at Boston and places them at Exeter. And it took us time to dig that up and to figure this out. So again, it was something that was hidden by God's hand that this movement uncovered. That is, prior to this movement, Adventists have not had an understanding of Boston that it is midnight. And we mistakenly believe, all Adventists believe, that it's the midnight cry at Exeter that is what Ellen White was referring to when she talks about midway. But we know that midway is Boston. And that date is July 21st, but the symbol that we derive here is the fifth day of the fourth month. So what's the significance of the fifth day of the fourth month? What is it connected to? What have we done with the first day of the fifth month? We looked at the Old Testament and we found verses that address the first day of the fifth month. We did the same with the first day of the first month and the 10th day of the seventh month. So what do we do with the fifth day of the fourth month? Do we look in the Bible?
We should.
We should, and we did. What did we find? Where did we find the fifth day of the fourth month? July 21st, 592 BC. On the fifth day of the fourth month, Samuel Snow here in 1844 is presenting the midnight cry. But in the book of Ezekiel, Ezekiel begins to prophesy. And it's on the fifth day of the fourth month, in the fifth year of Jehoiachin's captivity, in the 30th year of the Jubilee cycle. And it happens to be July 21st on the Julian calendar as well. So it's not just that it's the fifth day of the fourth month, it's July 21st. So what's the significance of seeing that Samuel Snow at Boston is the fifth day of the fourth month and Ezekiel is prophesying on the fifth day of the fourth month? What's the significance of that? Is Samuel Snow then Ezekiel in a symbolic sense?
Very symbolically.
Yes, right? So his message is the same message as Ezekiel. So we can tie Ezekiel to Samuel Snow. Now, remember, Ezekiel's going to begin lying on his left side on the 5th day of the 4th month. And he's going to finish on the 10th day of the 5th month. And then he's going to begin lying on his right side on August 15th, 591 BC. So we can see in Ezekiel, he's not only got the symbol for midnight, but he also has the symbol for the midnight cry. And then Ezekiel, he's going to, in Ezekiel 4, verse 6, he's going to have this 390 days. And this 390 days is going to go back to the 15th day of the 8th month on the biblical calendar in 977 BC, with the prophecy of Josiah being given to Jeroboam when he's offering at the golden altar in Bethel. So we have a symbol of the midnight cry. And the prophet is going to say, oh, altar, altar. He's going to double. It's a doubling. And this prophecy of Josiah is going to be fulfilled 350 years later. And it's going to be used by Ezekiel as the starting point for the 40 years. And the 390 years is the giving of the prophecy, gives a starting point for the siege of Jerusalem. And he's going to be marking the destruction of Jerusalem on the 10th day of the 5th month. So all of these things that we look at here in Millerite history, they're tying together so many threads from Scripture, but they do so by simply looking at a symbol. If we didn't have this symbol of the 5th day of the 4th month, could we have tied Samuel Snow to Ezekiel?
No.
No, we couldn't have. That's the thing that ties us to Ezekiel. But also, we have a chiasm here. And this chiasm, this structural chiasm that we have in Millerite history, that we noticed, that is when we noticed midnight, that allowed us to look at the chiasms in 457 BC. So we looked at these here first, but the first thing we found was this chiasm in Millerite history. Now, we hadn't, even when we look at our prophetic mirror, the prophetic mirror doesn't really present a chiasm. Right? It's not set up like that. It does once we look at the 1260s, the two 1260s, but the whole prophetic mirror itself doesn't. And so the initial chiasm that we have is the week of Christ, which Samuel Snow is going to unlock in Millerite history. And then we're going to have this chiasm of the two 1260s that parallels the week of Christ. But then we find this chiasm in December of 2015 in Millerite history, from the 1st day of the 1st month to the 10th day of the 7th month. And this becomes very profound. So when we found the 1st day of the 5th month, of course, that was important. But once we find the 5th day of the 4th month, we find that Boston and Exeter are part of this structure. And we get this chiasm. This opens up all kinds of things for this movement. So in 2016, we now tie Ezekiel to Samuel Snow. But we also do something else. So in 2016, because we look at Ezekiel, we then look at Ezekiel's prophecy of the 390 years and 40 years. Now, I had looked at those before in 2014. So I knew the 390 years and the 40 years ended with the siege, but I didn't have a starting point for the 40 years. That is, I just placed it in the 13th year of Jeremiah. But I hadn't tied the 13th year of Josiah, the first year of Jeremiah's prophesying, but I hadn't tied it to the prophecy of Josiah yet. That is, when I was first presenting the 390 and the 40 years, I hadn't noticed the prophecy of Josiah. That is, I hadn't looked at Jeroboam. I just knew that the kingdom was divided in 977. And so the siege began in 587. So that's 40 years, 390 years. And then I did the 40 years back from that. And that gave me the 13th year of Josiah. And all I had for the 13th year of Josiah was Jeremiah's prophesying. And that seemed sufficient. But when I recognized the prophecy of Josiah in 2016, this opened up something else, right? We started to look at the symbolic use of dates in an expanded form. And this is going to lead to what we understand in 2017. So I don't know necessarily the best way to present all of this. I'm just doing the best I can right now. This is a lot of information. But one thing that I'm trying to illustrate here is that there's an unfolding of light in Millerite history. And that unfolding of light occurred somewhat after the passing of the time. It occurs of course, in the Midnight Cry, because we get more light. And even after the passing of time, after October 22nd, 1844, the Adventists start to put some things into place. But at the end of the world, this movement has had a flood of light poured out upon it. And I know this is, you look at these dates, all of these numbers. I think that we should understand this chart. That is, this is not something that's beyond our understanding. We might not be able to remember all of it, all of the different dates, but we should understand them. We should know Samuel Snow's letters. We should know Midnight in the Midnight Cry. We should know the two chiasms, and we should know how to present Ezra 7 to 10 to show these two chiasms, and that the start of the 2300 days is connected to these structural chiasms, and that the 70 weeks, so you can see Pentecost, that addresses the 70 weeks, the midst of the week in that seventh week of Christ, the 70th week, the week of Christ. And so that's tied to the 70 weeks in 457. Doesn't mean that we start counting the 70 weeks at a different date, but it means that the year 457, we know that the start of the 70 weeks is the center of this period of time, this 140 days, which is October 22nd or October 29th, the 10th day of the 7th month. And it's going to line up with October 22nd, 1844. But it's also going to line up with the end of the 70 weeks with the stoning of Stephen. He's going to be stoned on the 10th day of the 7th month. And we should know these things. Like these are things that we can't understand. Again, we may not be able to remember all of these numbers and all of these dates, though I think if we presented it to people on a regular basis, we would come to memorize these dates much more than watching me present them. And I think people should practice writing these things out. Now, this one's rather complicated, but if you go back to some of the earlier charts or diagrams I have here, so the first one here that I showed you, I don't know if it was this one. It wasn't this one, but this is just an example of it. You have 457 BC, and you have the different chiasms, the dates. The first day of the first month when they leave Jerusalem, they arrive at the river Ahava, the 3 days. The 12th day of the first month. And just to come back to this where we started with Miller, on the 12th day of the first month, he's going to start the 70 weeks there. But you can see that that can't be correct, because we know the 70 weeks don't end with the crucifixion of Christ. And definitely Christ is not crucified 2 days before Passover. But we can also see that the going forth of the commandment is connected with the first day of the first month to the 12th day of the first month. That is, once they leave Babylon, he has the commandment in hand. We don't know exactly when that was written out. One thing we can say is that it was written out before the first day of the first month. Because in order for him to leave on the first day of the first month, Artaxerxes must have given him this decree prior to that. Then we have, them arriving at Jerusalem, and this 54 days, we can see that's a symbol of the 5th day of the 4th month, and the 107 days, the symbol of the 10th day of the 7th month. Now, a person could argue it's 53 and 54, or 53 and a half and 53 and a half, however you want to look at it. But I think this is the best way to represent it. Now, I have over there the 89 days on the right. That's something else. I mean, that's the period of time in which the divorce has happened. And there's some things to learn from that still. I don't think that we should neglect that part of what happens. Now, particularly, let's just address it right now. So what is the divorce? Is a divorce going on right now, symbolically, in this movement?
There's been a separation, and quite honestly, the divorce is about to occur.
Right. And has it been according to the law? Because they're going to do this according to the law. Are we doing this according to the law?
It's having to be done according to the law.
Yeah. What does that mean then, when we do it according to the law? Does that mean we have to stick to God's word?
Very much.
Yeah. We have to do things according to the law. This is not something that's a rash act. It's not something that's hurt feelings. It's something that needs to be done. That is, in order for this movement to accomplish its task, just as it was in 457 BC, we had to have this message given to this movement, the message of Ezra.
The message of Ezra and Ezra 10 specifically.
Yeah. But all this message of Ezra that we see is an unfolding of these structural chiasms and these dates and this chronology. And we can't neglect it. That is, we can't think that we can just accept October 22nd, 1844 and be saved. Because a test is going to come to each person. We can't just accept July 18th, 2020 and expect to be saved, because a test is going to come to each person. And the test is not your understanding of numbers and chronology. That's a misrepresentation that's been done again and again within this movement to sort of denigrate this message that God gave this movement, that somehow it's just a bunch of numbers. This is about character. Numbers are involved. Why are numbers involved? Why is God using this chronology to test and prove his people? Why did he do it in 1843 and 1844?
Palmoni.
Okay, Palmoni. And right, and this brings us right back to Daniel chapter 8. Because if we think about it, we think about all the things, all the prophecy, everything in God's word, and we have this in 8:13. I heard one saint speaking, and another saint said unto that certain saint which spake, How long shall be the vision concerning the daily and the transgression of desolation, to give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden under foot? And he said unto me, unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. So this is Palmoni. That's that certain saint. And we say that this, Daniel 8:14, that's the foundation of Adventism, the sanctuary, in connection with the 2,300 days. It's the foundation and central pillar of Adventism. But if it's the foundation of central pillar of Adventism, is not July 18th the foundation and central pillar of this movement? And we have to understand, what is July 18th?
A return to midnight.
Okay. Explain what you mean by that.
We need to have the understanding of what midnight means to us before we can really give a midnight cry.
Right. So it's a return to the old paths, right? It's a result of the study of Millerite history. It's not the result of man trying to make a prediction about Nashville. This was God directing us back to Millerite history, back to the foundation, back to the Bible, to uncover light for our feet. That we didn't fully understand what God was doing, that we had some errors in our understanding, doesn't take away from the fact that God was leading this movement. And what people do is they throw out the baby with the bathwater. We can see that God has been leading us. Doesn't mean everything that we understood was correct, but you can't get rid of the numbers. You can't get rid of the chronology, because when you do so, you're undermining Adventism at its foundation.
If you get rid of the numbers,
Yeah.
then you are saying that that certain saint, Palmoni, does not know what he is doing.
And that Satan somehow is the one leading this movement. That means,
Correct.
And if that's true, how do we have any confidence in the 2,300 days?
It destroys the confidence in the 2,300 days.
Yeah, because the reason we ended up where we were is because we were studying the prophecies of the Old Testament and their relationship to Millerite history. All of these numbers came as a result of that. That we took those numbers and took the time that was happening in our movement and used it to make a prediction. It was in God's providence, but it doesn't mean that the numbers were wrong or the date was wrong. They may be failed predictions, but they are ordained by God to tell us something. And they tell us that the foundation was laid correctly. I find it very sad that people who were once in this movement can have rejected something so solid and just dismiss it as being from man. Because if this was from man, I don't know how to explain it. Because it's beyond any person's ability to produce what we see. Because we can now just look at, and this was rejected. So what we just presented here, this chart, this was rejected by this movement on December 6th. That is, they said, we can't do this. We can't do what you have here in 457 BC. It doesn't stand. Well, what is their basis for saying it doesn't stand? Can they dispute any of this structure? Did they even attempt to?
They did not.
They did not. right? They just dismissed it as the symbolic use of numbers as being error, that there's no significance in the 2 periods of 54 days. There's no significance in the 107 days. There's no significance in the chiasm that points to Pentecost. There's no significance in the chiasm that points to the 10th day of the 7th month. There's no significance in the 20th day of the 9th month, or in the first day of the first month, or the 5th day of the first month. None of these things matter. It's just a deception. But if it's a deception that's in God's word. So we have to ask ourselves, is this something that was contrived? Did I somehow invent this by taking the Bible and twisting it in some way? Can we not see that this is just plain as day?
When you spend the time to search and to study,
Mm-hmm.
and you follow the admonition that Mrs. White had given,
Mm-hmm.
that those that would be giving the last warning message would be searching their Bibles in a manner similar to that of Father Miller,
Mm-hmm.
and that we are to dig as miners looking for precious gems and precious metals.
Mm-hmm.
We will find. If we're going to rely upon the strength of man, the strength of the creation rather than the creator, if we are going to rely upon man to explain the words of the creator, then we are going to fall.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you know, I was obviously a part of finding this structure. So one of the things that had been happening is there was, on the part of Parminder and Tabo, particularly, this attempt to try to discredit me. But we've seen it also happen in this movement since December 6th as well, haven't we? That instead of attacking directly, because Satan doesn't do that, what does he do? Rumor and innuendo.
He attacks the messengers.
Yeah. So he attacks the messengers instead of the message. And I'm not anybody special, so I mean, I'm sure you can find lots of faults with me. But we can't do that. I mean, sometimes I'm a little bit rude in some studies when I disagree with people. So that can be a reason that people won't even look at these things anymore. Right? People have decided, because Theodore's a bit of a jerk sometimes, that the message that he gives isn't the message that we should be studying. And so people are, through rumor and innuendo, they're hindered from looking at this message that we studied here today. And how many people, how many other studies are going through this type of study right now? Is anybody looking at the chronology? I mean, maybe they are sometimes. But our study right now, the focus isn't on the foundation of this message to go back to the old paths and to understand why we're here. Instead, we're caught up in new and exciting, sensational ideas. And that's much more attractive. And what's the attraction of those things? Why is this less attractive than the new and the sensational? I know I'm getting a bit over time here, but what is it that's unattractive about this and attractive about what's generally being presented in this movement? What's unattractive about what we just did? Just from a personal perspective, what would be unattractive about it?
I don't know what you're getting at, but in some
Well,
cases it's because It's the old paths. It's the old stuff.
Yeah. And it's also a lot of work, isn't it?
Yeah, it can be.
It's a lot of work. There's no doubt about it. That to understand the things that we have just gone through, you can't just go through them once and, oh, that's fine. The new and sensational one is it's new, but it also isn't as much work. It's very passive. You just kind of open up your eyes, you look at the headlines, you see what's happening. Everybody's talking about it. It's exciting. I mean, that's all anybody's talking about is the pandemic and COVID and all this. No matter who you are, no matter what your beliefs are, that's the topic of the day. This is old stuff. It's not very interesting. And so people aren't spending the time on it as they should. And people have plainly told me that I'm somehow making this a test, and that's the same as Tabo and Parminder when they talk about the lines. So they try to compare what I'm doing with Parminder. And I don't see how it can be anything similar. This is the foundation of our message. It's not some speculative thing. It's something that's pretty sound. So I'm encouraging people to try to draw these things out themselves. I'm going to get together some of the papers. I hope that you guys read them and the people on the internet as well. If anybody needs any of these papers, you can find them on my academia.edu site. So if you search Theodore Turner and type in something like 2520, you'll find the academia site and all my papers there. But also you can email theodorejames.turner@gmail.com, and I can email you any of these things that you would like to have. So, and this isn't about me, of course. This is about what God has done leading this movement. And we have to decide, is this solid or is it not? And if it's not solid, we have to show that it's not solid. We can't just dismiss it because we don't like somebody, or it's not interesting, or it's too difficult. So let's close with a word of prayer. Dear Father in heaven, we are thankful once again for this study. And we know that as we draw near to December 25th, to the end of our line, that we need to draw closer to you and to one another. Help our words, Lord, to represent you. Thank you for hearing our prayer. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.